So, thank you very much, Erkan, for the warm introduction and also for the invitation. It's an honor to be here and to give today's lecture about Salafism. When Erkan approached me like 3 or 4 weeks ago and asking me to give a lecture on this particular topic, I was a bit overwhelmed since my current research doesn't really evolve around Salafism, although the Salafia Jihadiyya, the Jihadi Salafism, is something that we, meaning my junior research group and me, are concerned with since more than 2 years now, and also the Islamic State somehow stems from the Salafi current that I want to elucidate you about today. So, first of all, just let me give a bit of a disclaimer, because the topic of my lecture today is Salafism, a specific phenomenon that is a specific form of Sunni Muslim religious thinking and practice. And the interest in this form of religiosity, its social and political implications, and among other things, its attractiveness for young Muslims worldwide, became general after September 11, 2001. So you can see the 9/11 is still some kind of a hallmark that changed much also for researchers concerned with Muslim religious practice and living. So, Roland Meyer, who wrote a seminal volume on global Salafism, which was published, if I remember that correctly, in 2014, observed that the interest, the general interest in Salafism has also been preceded by general interest in fundamentalism, which developed, and so I argue, in the light of a global resurgence of religion in the public sphere and the failure of secularization theories in particular that argued for a dwindling relevance of religion in all spheres of society. And this is not restricted to Muslim religiosity or Islam, but also to Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and many other forms forms of religiosity and religion. But I will come back to this later. So the increasing interest in this phenomenon by academics, state authorities, and the general public has produced the problem that Salafism has become somehow an imprecise and overused category, not least because it sometimes seemed to be a buzzword that academics use or have to use to increase their chances in grant application processes. And second, the term insinuates that there has been any homeostatic, coherent phenomenon or any homogeneous movement that we can refer to as Salafism. On the contrary, Salafism's ambiguity and fragmentation poses challenges to pin down precisely what the common creed of Salafi individuals, groups, and movements is, as Roland Meyer also has argued. I'm convinced that the best way to tackle these problems is first to look for at the historical developments of this phenomenon. So in the first part, just to give you a quick outline, in the first part of my lecture I will therefore look into the basic doctrines and the general evolution of what has been named as a self-referential term, the Salafiyya, a religious movement that emerged in the mid-19th century, particularly in Egypt, but also Morocco, Algeria, and Syria. I will track its evolution until today, focusing mainly on the Middle East and North Africa. Its main thinkers shared some central doctrines, but the Salafiyya took very different manifestations depending on the social, cultural and political context in the different regions, from Morocco even to northern India. However, today I will focus on the development of the Salafiyya in the Middle East and North African region, and not consider Turkey as well as Central and South Asia. So the struggle of ideas between the MENA Middle East, North African region and other parts of the globe will not play a role in my lecture, although it is of great importance for the development of the Salafiyah as a whole, which can be seen, for instance, in the exchanges between Egyptian and Pakistani or Northern Indian reformists and other thinkers and writers. In the second part of my lecture, I will change the focus on Europe and look into the ways in which debates around Muslim life have been impregnated with security concerns, mostly. So let me just say that most of the literature that you can find today about the topic is concerned with Salafism as an issue or as a topic points to contextual factors of a political, social or economic character on the macro or even meso level. Other approaches focus on micro factors related to general human psychological, cognitive and emotional dispositions. All of these explanations why Salafism is and has been and still is so successful play a role, as can be seen from anthropological studies in particular, such as that of Annabel Inge on Salafi women in London, Susanne Olsen on Swedish Salafis, or Martijn de Koning and his colleagues on Salafis in the Netherlands and Belgium. But I won't go deeper into that today. So, starting, what did the Salafiyah movement in the 19th century evolve around? It was the central concept that they had in mind when writing and thinking about their work was the Arabic term of Islah, which means reform, but also denotes more specifically orthodox reformism of the type that emerges in the doctrinal teachings of people such as Muhammad Abduh, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, and the writings of Rashid Rida, for instance, and the numerous Muslim authors who were influenced by these masters and, like them, considered themselves disciples of the Salafiyah. The Arabic root of Islah is Sad Lam Ha, and its derivatives this root and its derivatives in the Quran cover a wide range of meanings, ranging from virtuosity, working towards peace, agreement, urging people to reconcile, etc. So the verbal noun muslihun, which are the people that refer to themselves as practicing Islah, think of themselves as being saintly in spirit, but is also mentioned in the Quran for people that are that preach peace and harmony, that are concerned with the moral perfection of their fellow humans, that strive to make men better. So Islah is a permanent feature in Islamic history, as muslihun, so these people, work towards a situation where the lives and religious practices of Muslims would conform to the norms and values inscribed in the Quran and in the Sunnah, which means the traditions about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So, making the lives and religious practices of Muslims conform to this set of values, norms and beliefs to the greatest degree possible. So if we look at the emergence of the Salafiyah in the 19th century, we can pin down some decisive factors, which were the emergence of the Wahhabi movement, and I think there will also be a lecture on Wahhabism coming up, right? Yes. In this lecture series. So the emergence of the Wahhabi movement on the Arabian Peninsula and its strive for political and moral reform, the development of printing presses, the liberal evolution of the Ottoman Empire, and deeply entangled to it, the influence of European thinking and culture, including Christian missionary activities and protective mandates over Christians in the MENA region. So there were several authors, like the ones I mentioned before and others around them, that have found that their culture is somehow lagging behind European cultures, and who were then analyzing the state of affairs. And these writers and thinkers were inclined to refute the thesis that Islam can be held responsible for the cultural backwardness of the Muslim peoples. And if you want to go deeper into that debate, I warmly recommend to look into the discussion between Renal and Al-Afghani that happened after Al-Renal's refutation of his hypothesis of the incommensurability of Islam and science. So these writers try to argue against it and try to prove that Islam is very much compatible with modern science and modern and liberal thinking even. So we can say that although the movement's goals were rooted in religious concepts and articulated in religious terminology, its ideas of progress, renewal, the promise of a better future, its social, cultural and political implications for the emancipation of the people of the MENA region were nevertheless attractive to many other intellectuals in that region during that period. So the Salafiyya can be regarded as a part of the cultural and intellectual awakening of the Middle East and North Africa during the 19th century, which is referred to as the Nahda. So others, secular writers as well, during that period also longed for liberation from foreign domination, securing or tried to secure their right, the right of their people for education, progress, and also national dignity. So the social, political, and cultural demands made by the leaders of modern Islam had more effect than their doctrinal intervention, because it spread out into different spheres and intellectual circles all throughout the Arab world, if you want to. So, what are the basic doctrines? I've spoken about Islah already. So, we can say that in the Hadith literature that comprises the corpuses of what we call the Sunnah, the moral and religious regeneration of Islam is constantly needed, and the Muslihun are those who view themselves as agents of such a profound regeneration. So the Salafiyya therefore became a movement that strove to improve Muslim lives and build up a socio-cultural framework working for the social, moral and intellectual evolution of their communities. So they sought to improve, correct, reorganize, renovate and restore Muslim societies. And we can also see that in the first writings of the people that I have mentioned earlier on, particularly of Muhammad Abduh and Jamaluddin al-Afghani, political, social and cultural considerations are more important than religious ones, interestingly. So their ideas evolved around how to reform and improve and correct the teaching in institutions of Muslim higher education, particularly the Al-Azhar, of which Muhammad Abduh later on became the principal, and also the Zaytuniyya in Tunis. They also sought to improve the Muslim legal system, religious brotherhoods and orders, particularly Sufi orders. I will come back to this later, who they accused of harboring innovations or blameworthy innovations, but I will come back to that later on. Wider social structures of Muslim societies, also including demands for reform of strictly secular domains, such as the school system, the state administration, the military regime, and so on and so forth. So their reformist aims diffused through several charitable organizations and scholastic organizations, but also through periodicals. I have already mentioned that the rise and increase of printing presses throughout the Arab world was a decisive factor for the rapid dissemination of Salafi ideas. So in their own view, in their self-understanding, they said they would respond intellectually and practically to the Quranic injunction to command right and forbid wrong, al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, which is a central tenet of Islamic ethics and covers a wide range of implications. And so they saw upon themselves the obligation to the head of the community, but also on every single member of the Ummah, the Muslim community as a whole, that is called to play their part in commanding right and forbidding wrong. And if you want to get deeper into that, I recommend Michael Cook's book, which was published in 2010, if I remember that correctly, which has exactly that title, Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong. And it's a great reading. So reformers referred to this particular dictum to justify their actions and appeal to other Muslims. And now we have to ask ourselves, okay, if we talk about commanding right and forbidding wrong, how should it be done? And the solution for the Salafiyya was to return to the first principles of Islam, by taking an unobstructed look into the past that they want to discover and uncover the right way or pristine way to deal with the present and show how Islam should be lived, interpreted and proclaimed. So how can one know what needs to be commanded and what to be forbidden? So if these reformists were talking about the return to the first principles, then they meant that people should return to the revelation of God's word as is fixed in the Quran and its natural complement, which is the Sunnah of the Prophet. And Muslims must abide by these two sources, by these scriptures, and remain faithful to them. So by adopting the values of faith in their authentic purity, contemporary Muslims would be able to gain the temporal power and moral well-being that enabled the first Muslims and their successors to conquer and rule vast territories. So what they essentially did is reaffirming the divine character of the Quran, discounting any rationalist interpretation, also in defense against European Orientalists and scholars of Islamic studies, and their particular psychological and hermeneutical approaches to the scriptures. So if we claim that those whom I refer here as Salafiyya idealize the pious forefathers or pious forebears, to whose example they want to return and call people to return to this example, we have to ask ourselves, of course, who were these Salaf? Why are they held in such high esteem? What do we know about these people and their conceptualization of a Muslim society and Islamic law? So the Salaf or Salaf as-Salih, the pious forefathers, is a term that usually refers to the first 3 generations of Muslims living around 610 when the Quran was first revealed to Muhammad, and 855. That should be CE and not BCE. Sorry for that. So usually one goes back to 2 ahadith in the hadith literature. One of them is the best of you are those of my own epoch, then those who follow on, then those who follow them. So this is a saying that is, or a tradition that gives the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, defining who were the best among his companions, and then those who follow after them. And the other hadith is, honor my companions and those who follow them, and those who follow these, after which untruth will appear. So we're basically talking about the companions, the successors, and then the successors of these successors, covering the term between 610 and 855. And these are collectively referred to as the pious forebears or pious forefathers, as-Salaf as-Salih. So you can see in here that first period is marked by those who first converted to Islam at Mecca, and then those who converted at Medina to Islam after the Prophet Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. And then with the death of the Prophet and the death of the last companions who knew the Prophet personally, it lasts until approximately the death of Ibn Hanbal, one of the founders of the four Sunni schools of law. So, when the Salafiyya referred to these people as examples for the living and thinking and religious practice of Muslims, there were ideas of anteriority, of course, linked with ideas of authority and exemplariness. The predecessors were held to be perfect examples of Muslim orthodoxy, piety, holiness, and religious knowledge, and this makes them worthy of being taken as role models and guides for the daily life of contemporary Muslims. So each of the qualities that is given, which is just an interesting side note, I guess, each of the qualities given prominence by Islamic ethics is also personified in one or another of the pious forefathers. So Ali, for instance, typifies courage and bravery, and others such as Abdullah ibn al-Abbas, learning, and so on and so forth. So the ideas of authority and exemplariness also linger in Islamic ethics until today. But still, the collective that was referred to as the Salaf is vaguely defined until today. And so you find discussions around who comprises this collective, and one party includes, for instance, the wife of the Prophet, and then the companions, and the successors and the successors after them. But it's also used in relation to the founders of the four Sunni schools of law. But also highly esteemed personalities are counted among those considered as guides to salvation, who have worked to rejuvenate Islam and faithfully transmitted the ideals of the Salaf. So even people who lived after 855 are sometimes counted among the Salaf because they are seen as particularly exemplary persons. Coming back to the 19th century Salafiyya, just to give you some names so that you get an idea, and some living dates of who was or who were the main figures in these circles, or in the movement that could be referred to itself as the Salafiyya. So Al-Abrani, Abduh, Kawakibi, I already mentioned, also the Algerian theorist and reformer Ibn Badis is to be counted among the Salafiyya. Rashid Rida, who died 1935, is a very famous figure because he was the chief editor of the periodical Al-Manar, which was one of the main means to spread and disseminate the ideas of the Salafiyya throughout the Arab world. But also people like Shakib Aslan, who's commonly referred to as the prince, as the sorry, where do I have it? The Prince of Eloquence, sorry, and others, particularly from the Maghreb countries, are also counted among the main masters of the early Salafiyya. So, what drove these people in calling their fellow Muslims to return to the first principle and the example of the Salaf, and calling themselves Ahlul Salaf, so meaning followers of the Salaf, and also referring themselves as those who rejuvenate Islam, renew Islam, Mujaddidun, was the desire to refute the errors of their own century, to combat those sects within Islam that were believed to have introduced blameworthy innovations into Islam that also caused the backwardness of Muslims, and to bring the faithful back to what they regarded the purity of pristine Islam or pristine faith and worship, and to restore the Sunnah by the study and imitation of the Prophet's tradition. So it was also about embodying some kind of an ideal past, reviving this ideal past, not only by writing and thinking and preaching about it, but also by embodying the example of the Salaf. And this is also playing a role in today's Salafi movement as well. So another idea that was deeply ingrained into their thinking is the notion of solitude, of being a lone voice of faithfulness in the wilderness of ignorance that marks the spirit of their times, replete with authoritarian arrogance, worldly skepticism, and the hostility of conformist scholars and preachers. So reformists cultivated a self-image of the nonconformist who, however, acts with the certainty of being rewarded by God for the purity of his faith and his religious practice. And this is also something that very strongly lingers in the self-representations of today's Salafis. Rashid Birida, for instance, notes in his commentary on the Quran that such exceptional men were always strangers in their world, like Islam itself. And there's also a famous hadith that Islam came into the world as a stranger and it will end as a stranger. And that also inspired Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, for instance, in his theology. So you see the exchange of ideas and the continuity of ideas is very pertinent when we talk about this particular period and how it has influenced modern Muslim conservative Sunni thinking until today. So, and of course, connected to this notion of solitude is the notion that they view themselves as being somehow in a direct line with those prophets that were sent by the one God to his creation to call mankind back onto the right path. And of course, in the Old Testament, the Torah, and also in the Quran, you would find many stories about those faithful people calling mankind back onto the right path. So their approach to Islam was rooted strictly in the Quran, the Hadith, and the example of the Salaf. And so far, this is nothing extraordinary compared to other strands of the Sunni Muslim tradition, and Salafis do not divert very much compared to Muslim thinkers in the 9th or say 11th or 13th century. So this is very much common sense, so to say. But what somehow diverts from the common sense, or from the diversification of Sunni Muslim thinking throughout the time, is the Salafis not only turn against blameworthy innovations, to which I will come back in a minute, but also the strict rejection of the different, the 4 different Sunni schools of law. So they called themselves the La Madhhabiyya, the not having a school of law movement. At the same time, they argued that there's no Sunni school, or no one of the dominating Sunni schools of law, or traditional, is needed, but rather we have to turn to the one only original madhab, which is that of the Salaf. So they transferred the concept of the school of law back to the Salaf, and said they were the only school of law that should count for Muslims today. So what brought them mainly into conflicts with ruling authorities of their time, and also ordinary Muslims, was their strong turn against what they called blameworthy, or what is called in Muslim thinking, blameworthy innovations, bid'ah, that were deemed incommensurable with the book, the traditions, and the testimony of the Salaf on a dogmatic level and in the realm of worship. So both dimensions are important here. And they look down upon these innovations as potential sources of heresy and seeds of error that would jeopardize the moral and political cohesion of the Ummah, and constitute then potential sources of internal strife, hence threatening pristine Islam and the Muslim community as a whole. So what were these blameworthy innovations, and what are they still today? Because Salafis and also jihadi Salafis are strongly arguing against practices such as certain funeral rites, the celebration of the birthday of a prophet, the veneration of saints and holy men at tombs, mausoleums, the pilgrimages to holy trees, and many other forms of what you could call popular religion. And so, turning against these innovations, for the Salafiyya meant to develop a moral regime that included both the public and the private domain. And they tried to encourage a moral rectitude for their, or encourage their fellow Muslims for moral rectitude, and aimed at banning vice, gambling, use of alcohol, drugs, and other things that they also deemed are blameworthy, and keeping people from practicing their faith in the right way. And we can also count other mostly charitable and social activities that they have undergone in order to provide a coherent framework for the whole Muslim society. So this, if you may call it the original mid-19th century Salafiyya, was then succeeded by something that Reinhard Schulze, for instance, calls the Neo-Salafiyya at the outset, or that emerged at the outset of the 20th century. A movement that was mainly concerned with the departure and the separation from the colonial societies. And Hassan al-Banna's Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, was one of the leading movements during that period, also disseminating and furthering the ideas. So, but also other groups and organizations emerged during that period. So as to just to mention a few, the Society of Muslim Youth, the Naqshbandiya order in Syria and Turkey, the USSR, and also parts of India became a reservoir for many Neo-Salafi organizations and groups. So that movement also took up the teachings of their masters and tried to work towards spreading its ideology among the masses of the people, and excuse me, and oriented itself towards the emerging ideas of pan-Islamism, but also blended it and blended Islam with Arab nationalism that was also emerging during that period, 1920s, 1930s, and 40s. Became a much stronger topic in the Arab world and prevalent timely topic during that one during that period. But in the end, one has to acknowledge that mainly the Neo-Salafi teachings were failing against the ascending nationalism in the 1930s. Why was that so? Because particularly the younger generation developed a great skepticism about the ideas of reform and Islam, as they discovered a new vision of social and moral realities coming up with European thinking, European influences, ideas such as secularity, nationalism, and so on and so forth. They also discovered new philosophies, new ideologies, new political ethics, distributed through also printing press and global communication. And also the reality of younger people with their particular socio-economic problems, the needs that creates, the amusement it offers, and the collective tasks it imposes was much more important for younger people. Hence the call for constant meditation of the meditation of the scriptures and the tradition of the Salaf went fairly unheeded by the younger generation. And at the same time, if we look at the period from the 1950s to the 1960s onwards, we can see a rise of power of new socio-political forces that superseded the monarchies and traditional social structures in the then post-colonial republican regimes that emerged between 1946, when Morocco has gained independence, and 1962. And so societies at large were much more oriented towards nationalism, political liberation, and the socio-economic and socio-political transformation that also, one has to acknowledge, somehow cut the ground from under the feet of the Neo-Salafi movement, and Islam ceased to be understood as a progressive ideology as it was during the first period, but rather harboring ideas that were increasingly regarded as outdated. So, as a result, one could say that religion, ruled to an increasing extent by politics, found itself involved in a struggle, if not in a revolution, whose objectives were beyond its scopes. So it was more about politics than about religion. And the Neo-Salafi proponents were trying to cope with these developments, but couldn't really keep pace with it. So if we go further to the Neo-Salafia the Neo-Salafia from the 1960s onwards, and to the phenomenon that is commonly referred to as modern Salafism, we see, first of all, that we see the failures of the post-war national states, exemplified by the Arab defeat in 1967, the disparities, harsh disparities in wealth and wide-ranging corruption as well. Effects of social and economic modernization that furthered the diminished role of religion in all spheres of society. And the collapse of traditional forms of social solidarity that also disrupted many people's lives. So Mark Sedgwick writes that, I quote, the growth and spread of Salafism, like everything before it, from the Iranian Revolution to the return and mutation of the Muslim Brothers, could hardly have happened without the resurgence of Islam or without the resurgence of religion on a global scale, that we see throughout the whole region and in a global perspective in any religion. So, as I've said, this resurgence of religion did not happen in the Muslim world alone, but also can be traced in Christianity, for instance, with the rise of Pentecostalist churches in the 1970s and 80s until today, as well as in Judaism and other religions. And it can be therefore seen as somehow a reaction against secularity, or secular modernity and its constant monologue that delegated religion into the realm of something that is superfluous and non-essentialist, and what Kirlejev has called an optional hobby for individual people, like going fishing or writing poetry. And on the contrary, secularity or secularity theories have proved themselves somehow wrong. So Sedgwick also argues that Salafism then may also be seen as an instance of post-secularism, that's a reaction against the failures of contemporary states and societies, if no longer specifically the post-war national states that were discredited by the Arab defeat of 1967, which I just mentioned, which is now ancient history for most Muslims, and of even less relevance for Muslims living in the West. And what individuals and movements during the period of the 1980s, 1990s and onwards offered was to provide a new meaning to religious, yet seemingly outdated categories of social identity. So being a Muslim, being a Sunni Muslim. So they hence provided alternative forms of social identity, and of course tried or called for Muslims to build a framework of social solidarity against the disruptions caused by secularity. And the rapid modernization, of course, that not only took place in the Arab world but also worldwide. If we talk about social identities, one must understand, I think, that these are categories such as Muslim, Sunni, Shi'i, whatever you want to take. These are basically resources that people can use to make sense of reality. And so they provide some kind of shortcuts to potentially complex systems of beliefs, normative appeals and orientations, and help people understand who they are, how they are related to others, and how they should behave in certain situations. And Rohlmeyer again wrote eloquently in his introduction to the Global Salafism book that, I quote, "In a contentious age, Salafism transforms the humiliated, the downtrodden, the disgruntled young people, the discriminated migrant, or the politically repressed into a chosen sect that immediately gains privileged access to the truth. Salafis are therefore able to contest the hegemonic powers of their opponents, parents, the elite, the state, or dominant cultural and economic values of the global capitalist system, as well as the total identification with an alien nation which nation states in Europe impose." Quote end. And this certainly accounts on a global level, where the return to the example of the Salaf and the authority of the Quran and Sunnah promises to empower and change social identities, enable contestation of hegemonic powers of all sorts, and helps building social solidarity where individualism has prevailed. So what Salafis, modern Salafis, also developed throughout Europe in particular, but also in the Arab world. But in Europe they may seem to be more outstanding because they are more discernible from their visual appearance from the dominant or mainstream society, if you want so. So what they somehow embodied specific behavior codes and also trying to build up a new moral subjectivity that are not only expressions of piety, but also help to draw them clear boundaries between the in-group and the out-group, hence to separate themselves from the immoral or what they regard as the immorality of the surrounding societies. But also the separation from dominant or mainstream societies through embodiment in certain behavior codes and certain moral regime is also something that is not unique to Sunni Muslim practice at all, because it is also a feature of, for instance, committed Christians, particularly in Europe and the United States. So another means that they are using to spread their call to Muslims as well as non-Muslims. And I think this is a feature that differentiates them a bit from the early Salafiyya, which was a movement that was mostly concerned with inner Islamic mission and trying to call back fellow Muslims to the right path. But today's Salafis, particularly in Europe and the United States, of course, using da'wah, the call to Islam, the missionary activities, to also call to non-Muslims to convert, and this with sometimes great success. But what is interesting is that this kind of separation that they practice, from separation from dominant lifestyles, from mainstream societies, whatever you want to call it, also somehow reinforces and reaffirms their self-understanding as being, or embodying solitudinous, that being the lonely callers in the wilderness of ignorance and faithlessness and so on and so forth. But it also reclaims a stigmatized identity and elaborates the disadvantages into positive attributes. So basically saying, if they outcast us, it's only a proof that we are among the faithful ones. And this seems to me to be a pertinent issue in the discourse of Salafi groups, particularly in non-Muslim majority societies, where socio-political pressure even increases the experiences of stigmatization and also further the perception of a need to position oneself and to not bother you too much with text, but also give you some pictures. Also, I just brought you some headlines from international magazines and newspapers that ought to show the security discourse that evolves around the topic of Salafism in European societies in particular, where Salafism is mostly always connected to threat, to danger, to societies. Although Salafis today make up a very, very tiny minority among Muslims living in Europe and the US. But still, the threat is being seen, and people have to position themselves against it. I only found an example from a German Facebook discussion group that comprises more than 20,000 mainly Muslim members. And one of them, you see it in the lower left corner, one of them wrote, if you disagree with them, you're called a Salafi. And so the other one answers, if you disagree with the kuffar, you're suddenly named a Salafi. So people then feel the need to position themselves between these boundaries, or in that field of social tension, if you want to. So, and this brings us into an issue that I find necessary to reflect about, and that I want to give you on your way out of this lecture as something to think about. This is the issue of using emic or ethic concepts when we do research on such phenomena, or phenomena such as Salafism. Ethic terms are, of course, useful and important to gain an analytical perspective. Does anyone not know what the distinction between ethic and emic is? Okay, sorry. So ethic terms are those terms that are imposed by, for instance, researchers or outsiders on a specific group, and emic terms would be the terms or concepts that particular groups use for their self-understanding, or to articulate their self-understanding. So, although ethic terms are useful and important to gain an analytical perspective and to be able to look at certain phenomena on the macro level, however, they also pose problems, particularly in this field, in this highly securitized and politicized field around or evolving around the debates around Salafism in Europe in particular. But therefore they also pose problems and are an issue, particularly for those researchers in the field and for scholars that are careful of the risk of Orientalism, not trying to alienate people by imposing certain terms or concepts in order not to describe them, but to categorize them. And because once such concepts such as fundamentalism and Salafism and many others are picked up by the media and become incorporated into general usage, they tend to be rather used in a pejorative and pejorative way rather than in a descriptive way, and are applied so widely and so indiscriminately that they seem to lose all meaning and seem to be not applicable anymore for research purposes. Same might be true for propaganda as well. Something that is something that always the others do. They do propaganda, but what we do is media and information campaigns. But they do propaganda, and this is the bad thing, but we are on the good side. So this is something that you can also trace in general discourse today as well. So if we say that studies on fundamentalism as well as on Salafism covered uncomfortably variable phenomena, we run the risk of presenting circular arguments such that studies that aimed at finding common characteristics among Islamist movements found that these movements share a strong belief in an absolute truth emanating from an all-powerful God. So this is not what I would really count among top-notch research, or something that widens our perspective on the world. So, and the same counts for Salafism. And Salafi is an emic term, and people refer to themselves as Ahl Salaf until today. But it's also used by researchers as an ethic concept, and that might pose certain problems and also cause friction, because it is applied to people who, individuals, groups, and movements who self-identify as something else. They would self-identify as being simply Muslims. So how do we then, or what brings us as researchers in the position to categorize them as Salafis, fundamentalists, jihadis, whatever we may call them, if they refer to themselves as simply Muslims? And so that, and this is even done to the extent that some preachers in non-Muslim majority countries take up the term Salafism to argue that it has been invented by researchers and then melted into general debates in order to split the Muslim society, the Muslim communities. So it's also there is among Sunni Muslims there's a particular, or there to me it seems there's a particular sensibility and sensitiveness when it comes to using these kind of terms. And also Salafism is applied to groups and movements that are very different from each other. So we should we should take a stance from which we would differentiate and of course look at the shared characteristics and shared ideologies, shared belief systems, but also say how these groups and movements and individuals are different from each other. So it's what Salafism seems to be about. It's not merely about creed, but many Muslims are more concerned with, or are not concerned with, big questions of theology and jurisprudence in their daily life, but rather it's about spirituality and an uplifting moral and normative framework that determines a certain model of habitus that are far more important. So there's a plea in academia, particularly in anthropology and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies, to go back from these one-fits-all terms go back to what anthropologists have called thick descriptions, developed in studies where Muslim voices become audible as subjective expressions of spirituality and faithfulness within the framework of a globalized society. And with that, I thank you for your attention.